Hello everyone, this is a little time lapse of me working on part 1 of my blue tip tutorial over on Patreon. This was a bit of a fun experiment for me as I decided to use watercolours for my base and then colour pencils on top. I'm using the Windsor and Newton watercolour palette and I'm using my usual Fabriano Artistico hot press paper in extra white. For those blue tones in the head, I used colours like the ultramarine blue, cerulean blue for the lighter areas, and a bit of indigo blue and Payne's grey for those darker, more intense areas. I also used a very light blue wash to create some of that subtle shading in the white feathers, which I found worked really well. It was definitely a bit of trial and error, as I don't use watercolours very often, but I really enjoyed the process, and I find that it helps speed things up a bit, as colour pencils can be very time consuming. For the yellow tones, I used cadmium yellow mixed with a little bit of blue for the slightly more green areas in the breast. There was quite a lot of colour mixing involved to see what shades would work best, but I wasn't worrying too much about getting everything perfect at this stage, as I knew I'd be going in with the colour pencil on top. For this part of the wing, I used some of the darker blue shades, along with a mix of yellow and blue to create that lovely green colour on the upper part of the body. Once that was fully dry, after about 5 to 10 minutes, I started adding the coloured pencil. I always like to begin with the eye, as it gives me a focal point to work around and helps the bird start to come to life quite quickly. I'm beginning by blocking in those darker areas first, using colours such as dark indigo and delft blue from the Polychromos range. I also like to add a layer of white into the white feathers before building up the other pencil layers. I find this helps create a softer look and allows some of that brightness to show through as more layers are added. I tend to start with the lighter colours first and gradually build up to the darker tones, although for the areas that I know will be very dark, such as the eye, I'll often get in those darker values earlier on. I explain a bit more about the colours I use and why I use them over on Patreon. All of my tutorials on there are in real time, and the materials list, line art and reference photos are all included. So here I'm starting to be a bit more precise with my pencil to add in the finer details. I usually go back and forth between blending and adding finer detail as I go along. The blue tip has some subtle darker feathers within the white areas, so I'm using a lighter coal grey pencil to gently shade into those areas. I'm always making sure to work in the direction of the feathers, as this just helps to create a much more natural texture. I build up the depth in these areas a little more later on, but this stage is really important as it starts to add dimension and form. So here I'm actually using a dark grey pencil. This is the Payne's grey, which is on the cooler side, so it works well to darken the blue at the front, as it's not quite as vibrant as those feathers towards the back of the head. I'm using mostly the Polychromos and Luminance pencils for this piece, and usually blending with the Luminance and adding finer details with the Polychromos. Now here I'm actually using a Derwent Light Fast pencil, which is in the shade Salmon. This is a really nice soft pale pink, and I'm using this to add that subtle warmth to the white part of the feathers. I don't own that many Derwent Light Fast pencils, but there are a few shades that I consider must-haves, and I can't really match them with any other brand. I feel like the Salmon is one of those pencils that I reach for quite often, but I think the Polychromos Beige Red is probably the closest match to this pencil. So here I'm starting to bring out some of those darker feathers out into the lighter areas. I usually like to bring it up a bit more so that when I go in with the white pencil, I have a dark layer to kind of work over the top of. And then I'm just continuing to add extra detail to the lighter areas, going back and forth between adding darker details and then those lighter shades in between. Now here I'm using the Caput Mortem Violet, which is like a deep purple-brown shade, and I'm adding in those very slight hints of warmth I can see on the beak and in the feathers. It's quite hard to see unless you zoom in on the reference photo. I'm using a lighter pressure with this pencil just to glaze over and add a hint of that colour. And then here I'm using the White Museum Aquarelle pencil to bring some of those lighter details over the top of the darker feathers. This is always a fun part for me, as I really feel like it brings the drawing to life. And this white pencil is perfect for going over the top of all of those coloured pencil layers. From here I'm just continuing to refine areas, going back and forth between adding darker and lighter details, making sure I've got all of those different tones I can see in the white part of the feathers. I also added in a bit of manganese violet to the white parts, and I've darkened the eye area some more with the Derwent Drawing Ivory Black, which is a super pigmented black that just helps the eye stand out a little more. Moving on to the chest area, I did a little colour swatch to see which colours I'd like to use prior to starting, And then I started to build up the yellows in the chest using lighter yellows to begin with, and then moving on to deeper golden tones and olive browns. Further down, the breast has more of a yellow-green brown tone to it. So for this area, I'm using a mixture of olive greens and earthy browns to build up those tones. The feathers are overlapping, so I'm making sure to work in different directions as I'm adding the details in, following the natural flow of each feather rather than keeping everything going the same way. This helps to build up a more realistic texture and gives a better sense of depth where the layers of feathers sit over one another. Once I've got most of the layers down in this area, I then go in with a white pencil to start picking out the lighter feather details. I keep building this up gradually while continuing to refine the darker details in between. If you'd like to follow along with this real-time tutorial, the full-length video is available on my Patreon, and if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments section below. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.